A world before photography. To understand why Victorians photographed their dead, we must first understand what it meant to lose someone before photography existed. When a loved one died in the 18th or early 19th century, how did you preserve their memory? How did you hold on to their face, their features, the specific details of their appearance? For the wealthy, there were painted portraits. If you could afford to commission an artist, you might have a painting or miniature of your loved one. Some families, anticipating death or simply wanting mementos, would arrange for portraits while everyone was still living. But paintings were expensive, time-consuming, and available only to those with means. The vast majority of people could not afford them. Some families kept locks of hair, woven into jewelry or pressed into lockets. Hair was one of the few physical remnants that would last, that wouldn't decay. It could be formed into intricate designs, combined with the hair of multiple family members, creating tangible connections to the dead. But hair couldn't capture a face, couldn't preserve the specific arrangement of features that made someone recognizable. Death masks were another option for some. A plaster cast would be made of the deceased person's face, preserving its contours and expressions. These masks were eerie but effective at capturing exact physical details. However, they required skill to make and were still primarily accessible to the wealthy or prominent. And they captured only the face, frozen in the stillness of death, not the whole person. For most people, memory was all they had. When someone died, you held their image in your mind, tried to remember exactly how they looked, how they smiled, the specific shape of their nose or curve of their mouth. But memory fades. Over years and decades, the precise details blur. You might remember that your child had light hair, but was it golden or auburn? You recall your mother's face, but can you picture it exactly as it was? This forgetting was a source of profound grief. Parents who lost children worried they would forget their faces. Spouses feared losing the mental image of their departed partner. The inability to perfectly preserve someone's appearance added another layer to the pain of loss. Not only were they gone, but eventually even their image would fade from memory. Children were particularly vulnerable to this erasure. Infant and child mortality rates in the early 19th century were staggering by modern standards. Many children died before their first birthday. Others succumbed to diseases like scarlet fever, diphtheria, or tuberculosis before reaching adulthood. A family might have several children die in childhood, and parents had no way to preserve their images except through fallible memory. The death of a child was devastating enough. But the knowledge that in time, you might struggle to recall exactly what your child looked like, this compounded the grief. Some parents tried to describe their children in writing, creating detailed verbal portraits. But words could only do so much. The specific reality of a face, its unique combination of features, was difficult to capture in language. Into this world of fading memory and unpreservable faces came a revolutionary technology, photography. And it would transform not just how people documented life, but how they dealt with death. The invention of photography. In 1839, two photographic processes were announced almost simultaneously. In France, Louis Daguerre revealed the daguerreotype, which created images on silver-plated copper. In England, William Henry Fox Talbot announced his photogenic drawing process, which used paper negatives. Both methods allowed for the creation of permanent images, pictures that could capture reality with unprecedented accuracy and detail. The impact of photography on society was immediate and profound. For the first time in human history, ordinary people could have accurate images of themselves, their families, their surroundings. You didn't need artistic skill or wealth to create a portrait. You needed only access to a photographer and the money for the sitting, which while still expensive, was far more affordable than commissioning a painting. The early photographic processes had limitations. Daguerreotypes required long exposure times. Subjects had to remain completely still for anywhere from several seconds to several minutes, depending on lighting conditions and the specific equipment. Any movement would result in blur. The images were also unique objects. Each daguerreotype was a single image on metal, not reproducible the way modern photographs are. But these limitations didn't diminish photography's revolutionary impact. People who had never owned any image of themselves could suddenly have portraits. Families could document their members. Travelers could bring back images of distant places. The world became more visible, more documentable, more permanent. Photography arrived at a moment when death was an omnipresent reality. The Victorian era saw remarkable advances in many areas, but medicine was not yet one of them. People died young. They died from diseases we now prevent or easily cure. They died in childbirth, from infections, from accidents, from illnesses we barely remember. Death visited frequently, and families had to find ways to cope with repeated losses. The timing was almost perfect, though no one could have planned it. Just as photography became available, making it possible to preserve images cheaply and accurately, the Victorian era was also developing elaborate mourning customs. Queen Victoria herself, after Prince Albert's death in 1861, would wear mourning clothes for the rest of her life, 40 years, setting a standard for extended, public grieving. Mourning became ritualized, codified, surrounded by customs and expectations. Into this culture of elaborate mourning and frequent death came photography. And almost immediately, people recognized that the camera could serve a new function. If you could photograph the living, creating permanent records of their appearance, why not photograph the dead? Why not preserve one final image of the departed before burial made it impossible? The practice began within years of photography's invention. The first known post-mortem photographs date from the early 1840s. Some were taken hastily, simple documentations of death. Others were more elaborate, with the deceased posed carefully, dressed in their best clothes, arranged to look as peaceful and dignified as possible. The first post-mortem photographs. The earliest post-mortem photographs were straightforward in their purpose and execution. A child would die, and before burial, the family would summon a photographer. The child would be photographed, usually lying in a bed or crib, eyes closed, hands folded. The resulting daguerreotype would be the family's only image of that child, a memorial to a brief life. These early memorial photographs were treated as precious objects. They would be displayed in homes, often in the parlor where guests would see them. They might be kept in special cases or frames, protected from damage and light. Families would show these photographs to visitors, talking about the deceased, keeping their memory alive through the image. The practice spread quickly. What began as occasional memorials became common practice. Photographers began advertising post-mortem photography as a service. Some specialized in it, developing expertise in posing the dead, working with grieving families, and creating images that balanced honesty about death with dignity and beauty. The technical challenges were significant. Dead bodies were difficult subjects. They couldn't hold poses the way living subjects could. They had to be propped up, supported, positioned carefully. The photographer had to work quickly, as bodies would change and deteriorate. Lighting had to be managed carefully to create flattering images while dealing with the unnatural stillness and color of death. But photographers rose to these challenges. They developed techniques for posing the dead. They learned how to use stands, supports, and family members to keep bodies in position during long exposures. They experimented with lighting and composition to create images that were dignified and beautiful despite their morbid subject matter. For families, these photographs served crucial emotional functions. They provided concrete proof that the person had existed. They offered a last look, a final image to hold when memory began to fade. They were objects to touch, to look at, to share with others. In an era when death was frequent and unavoidable, these photographs helped people process grief, remember the dead, and maintain connections across the boundary between life and death. The custom was about to become much more elaborate, more widespread, and more strange. As photography evolved and became more accessible, as Victorian mourning culture grew more complex and codified, post-mortem photography would develop into a distinct genre with its own conventions, aesthetics, and purposes. The simple memorial photographs of the 1840s were just the beginning of a practice that would flourish for decades and leave behind thousands of haunting images. Victorian mourning culture. To fully understand post-mortem photography, we must immerse ourselves in Victorian mourning culture, which was elaborate, codified, and deeply serious. Death was not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes as it often is today. It happened at home, in the presence of family, and the rituals surrounding it were extensive and visible. When someone died in a Victorian household, the entire home would be transformed. Mirrors would be covered with black cloth or turned to face the wall. Clocks would be stopped at the time of death. Curtains would be drawn, and black crepe fabric would be hung on the front door to signal to neighbors and passers-by that death had visited this house. These customs were believed to help the soul transition peacefully and to show respect for the deceased. The body would remain in the home for days before burial, usually in the parlor, which was the formal receiving room. Family and friends would visit to pay respects, a practice called viewing the body or keeping vigil. The deceased would be dressed in their finest clothes or a special burial garment. They might be laid in a coffin, which would be open, or simply arranged on a bed or sofa. Flowers would surround them, both for beauty and to mask the smell as the body began to change. Mourning clothes were prescribed with rigid specificity, particularly for women. A widow would wear full mourning, entirely black clothing with no decoration, for at least a year, sometimes 2. Her dress would be made of dull black fabrics like bombazine or crepe. She would wear a black veil. Even her undergarments would be black. After full mourning came half mourning, which allowed for some gray or purple, but this period could last another year or more. The rules for men were less strict but still significant. They would wear black suits, black armbands, and black gloves for periods that varied depending on their relationship to the deceased. Children had their own mourning clothes, miniature versions of adult attire, dressed in black or white depending on their age and the family's traditions. Mourning jewelry was common and elaborate. Lockets containing hair of the deceased were worn close to the heart. Rings might be inscribed with the name and death date of the departed. Brooches could incorporate woven hair designs, sometimes combining hair from multiple deceased family members into intricate patterns. Jet, a black stone, became highly popular for mourning jewelry because of its dark color and the way it could be carved and polished. These mourning customs created a culture where death was acknowledged, displayed, and ritualized. Grief was not something to hide but something to perform publicly, to demonstrate the depth of one's loss and the respect one held for the dead. In this context, photographing the deceased was not morbid but natural, another way to honor the dead and preserve their memory. Queen Victoria herself exemplified this mourning culture after Prince Albert died in 1861. She withdrew from public life for years, wore black for the rest of her life, and maintained Albert's rooms exactly as he had left them. She had photographs taken of Albert on his deathbed, and she kept images of him throughout their homes. Her extreme mourning set a standard that influenced mourning practices throughout Britain and beyond. This was the cultural environment in which post-mortem photography flourished. Death was visible, mourning was elaborate, and preserving images of the dead fit naturally into existing customs. The photographs were simply one more element in an extensive ritual of remembrance and grief. The evolution of posing techniques. As post-mortem photography became more common, photographers developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for posing the dead. The methods evolved from simple documentation to elaborate staging, with some photographs attempting to make the deceased appear alive or at least peacefully asleep. The earliest and simplest approach was to photograph the deceased as they lay in bed, in a coffin, or on a surface prepared for viewing. These photographs were straightforward documentations of death. The subject's eyes would be closed, hands folded across the chest or at their sides. There was no pretense that the person was alive, but the images were composed to be as dignified and peaceful as possible. Photographers learned to arrange the deceased carefully. The head would be positioned on pillows to appear natural. Hands would be folded in prayer or holding flowers, rosaries, or other meaningful objects. The body would be dressed in the person's best clothes or special mourning garments. Sometimes a favorite possession would be placed with them, a doll for a child, a book for a scholar, tools for a craftsman. As techniques advanced, some photographers began posing the dead to appear alive or sleeping. This was more technically challenging but created images that families sometimes found less disturbing or more comforting. The deceased might be positioned sitting in a chair, as if resting. They might be propped up in bed, surrounded by pillows, looking as if they had simply dozed off. Children might be placed in cradles or held by parents, arranged to look like sleeping infants. Creating the illusion of life required considerable skill and sometimes elaborate equipment. Photographers used specially designed stands and supports to hold bodies upright. These devices, hidden behind the subject or concealed by clothing and furniture, would clamp onto the body to keep it stable during the long exposure times that early photography required. Without such supports, the body would slump or fall, ruining the image. The eyes presented a particular challenge. Closed eyes clearly indicated death, so some photographers experimented with ways to make subjects appear to have their eyes open. In some cases, eyes would be held or propped open during photography. In other cases, photographers would paint eyes onto the photographic image after development, creating the illusion of an open-eyed, living person. These painted eyes often have an unsettling quality in surviving photographs. They don't quite look right, appearing glassy or staring in ways that reveal the manipulation. Family portraits with the deceased became increasingly common. Parents might pose with a dead child, holding the baby or sitting with the small body arranged to look like a sleeping toddler. Siblings might be photographed with their deceased brother or sister, the living children standing or sitting beside their dead sibling. These family groupings served multiple purposes. They documented family bonds, showed the deceased as part of the family unit, and sometimes provided the only photograph that included all family members together. The living members of these photographs had to remain still during exposures that could last 30 seconds or more. This was difficult enough for adults but particularly challenging for children, who struggled to stay motionless. The deceased, ironically, was often the sharpest figure in these family portraits, perfectly still for the duration of the exposure, while living family members might show slight blur from inevitable small movements. Outdoor photography of the deceased was rare but did occur. Some families wanted images of the deceased in gardens or other meaningful outdoor locations. This required transporting the body, positioning it carefully, and working quickly before weather conditions changed or the body deteriorated. These outdoor memorial photographs have a particularly surreal quality, the dead posed in settings associated with life and activity. The photographers and their work. The photographers who specialized in post-mortem work occupied a unique professional position. They were both artists and service providers, technicians, and grief counselors. Their work required not just photographic skill but emotional sensitivity, physical strength, and the ability to work under difficult circumstances. Many general photographers offered post-mortem services alongside their regular portrait work. They might photograph weddings, families, and individual portraits during normal business hours, then be called to homes in the evening or night when death occurred. The work was emotionally taxing but financially important. Grieving families would pay premium prices for memorial photographs, understanding that timing was crucial and the work was specialized. Some photographers developed reputations as specialists in memorial photography. These practitioners were known for their ability to create dignified, beautiful images of the dead. They advertised their services specifically for this purpose, and families would seek them out when death occurred. These specialists understood the customs and expectations around death, could work efficiently with grieving families, and had developed techniques for the particular challenges of photographing corpses. The work required physical labor that standard portrait photography didn't. Dead bodies were heavy and difficult to position. Photographers often had to lift and move corpses, prop them up, hold them in place while arranging cameras and checking focus. They might work for hours setting up a single shot, especially for more elaborate poses or group portraits. The work was physically demanding, particularly when photographing adults. Photographers also had to navigate complex emotional situations. They worked with people in the immediate aftermath of loss, when grief was raw and overwhelming. Some families were composed and organized, knowing what they wanted and able to cooperate with the photographer's directions. Others were distraught, unable to make decisions, requiring the photographer to guide them through the process. Children were particularly difficult subjects in multiple ways, emotionally, because photographing a dead child was heartbreaking, and practically, because small bodies were challenging to position convincingly. The relationship between photographer and family was intimate and strange. The photographer entered the home at a moment of crisis and sorrow. They handled the body of the deceased with a familiarity that might seem shocking to grieving relatives. They made suggestions about positioning, clothing, and composition that might feel invasive or inappropriate. Yet families granted them this access because they desperately wanted the resulting photographs. The permanent images that would remain after burial made viewing impossible. Payment for post-mortem photography varied but was generally higher than for standard portrait work. Families paid premiums because the work was time-sensitive. It had to be done before burial, which often meant immediately. They paid for the photographer's willingness to work at odd hours, to travel to homes rather than receiving clients in a studio, and to handle the unpleasant realities of death. For photographers, this premium pricing made the emotionally difficult work financially worthwhile. The technical challenges were significant. Lighting in homes was often poor, requiring photographers to work with whatever natural light came through windows or to set up complex arrangements of mirrors and reflectors to direct light onto the subject. The exposure times were long, meaning any movement would create blur, not a concern for the deceased but problematic for living family members included in the photographs. Child mortality and its impact. The overwhelming majority of post-mortem photographs that survive are of children. This reflects a devastating reality of 19th-century life. Children died in enormous numbers, and their deaths were the losses that families most desperately wanted to commemorate. Infant mortality in the mid-19th century was staggering. In some areas and periods, 1 in 3 children died before reaching their first birthday. Many more died before age 5. Diseases like diphtheria, scarlet fever, whooping cough, measles, and cholera killed children regularly. Accidents took others. Some children were simply weak or sickly from birth and didn't survive infancy. Few families escaped losing at least one child. For parents, these deaths were agonizing. The child they had carried, birthed, nursed, and loved was suddenly gone. And in many cases, they had no photograph of that child from life. Photography was still expensive enough that many families couldn't afford routine portraits. They might wait for special occasions, planning to have family portraits made when children were older, when they could afford the expense. Then sudden death would make those planned photographs impossible. Post-mortem photography offered parents one last chance to have an image of their child. Even though the child was dead, even though the photograph would capture death rather than life, it was better than having no image at all. At least they would have something to remember their child's face, to prove that this child had existed, to show to others when speaking of their loss. The photographs of dead children are perhaps the most emotionally powerful images from this era. Babies are photographed in christening gowns, lying in cradles or held by mothers. Toddlers are arranged with toys, dressed in white gowns, positioned to look like sleeping angels. Older children might be posed sitting in chairs or lying on sofas, hands folded, faces peaceful. Some photographs include siblings, living children posed with their dead brother or sister in final family portraits. Memorial cards and keepsakes. Beyond the framed photographs displayed in homes, Victorian families found many ways to incorporate post-mortem images into portable keepsakes and memorial objects that could be carried, shared, and treasured in intimate ways. Memorial cards, also called mourning cards or death cards, were small printed cards distributed to friends and family members after a death. These cards typically included the name of the deceased, birth and death dates, perhaps a short verse or religious passage, and increasingly, a photograph. When post-mortem photographs became available, they were often reproduced in miniature form on these cards, allowing wide distribution of the image. The cards would be exchanged at funerals or sent through the mail to those who couldn't attend. Recipients would keep them in special albums or boxes, creating collections of memorial cards for various deceased friends and family members. These collections served as personal archives of loss, tangible records of all the deaths that had touched someone's life. Looking through a collection of memorial cards was an act of remembrance, a way to honor all the dead one had known. Lockets were particularly popular for holding post-mortem photographs. A small version of the image would be fitted inside a locket worn as jewelry, keeping the deceased literally close to the heart. Women especially wore these memorial lockets, sometimes layering multiple lockets to commemorate several deceased family members. Opening the locket to reveal the photograph inside was an intimate gesture, sharing one's grief and loss with trusted others. Some lockets were designed to hold both a photograph and a lock of hair, combining visual and physical relics of the deceased. The hair might be visible behind glass on one side of the locket, with the photograph on the other, or hair might be woven into a design on the locket's exterior while the photograph sat inside. These combinations created layered memorials, multiple ways of preserving and carrying the memory of the dead. Brooches and pins featuring post-mortem photographs were worn on clothing, particularly on black mourning dresses. These pieces of memorial jewelry made grief public and visible, signaling to others that the wearer was in mourning. In an era with strict social codes around grief and mourning periods, wearing a brooch with a deceased loved one's photograph communicated one's status as a mourner and requested appropriate treatment from others. Miniature versions of post-mortem photographs were created for various purposes. Tiny photographs might be set into rings, creating memorial jewelry that was less obvious than large lockets or brooches but still kept the deceased close. These ring-mounted photographs were particularly popular for remembering deceased children, with parents wearing rings bearing their children's images. Some families created elaborate memorial displays in their homes that went beyond single-framed photographs. They might arrange multiple images of the deceased, taken at different points in life if such photographs existed, or multiple post-mortem images from different angles, alongside other memorial objects. These displays might include the deceased's belongings, dried flowers from the funeral, written tributes, and religious items, creating shrine-like spaces dedicated to remembrance. Post-mortem photographs were sometimes reproduced as engravings for broader distribution. An engraver would create a printing plate based on the photograph, allowing multiple copies to be printed and distributed. This was particularly common for prominent community members whose deaths affected many people. The engraving might be published in newspapers or printed as standalone memorial sheets that could be framed or kept in books. The business of death photography. Post-mortem photography was not just a cultural practice but a business, and photographers who specialized in or offered memorial services developed specific marketing approaches and business practices around death. Photographers advertised memorial photography services in newspapers, especially in obituary sections where grieving families would be looking. Advertisements might emphasize speed, available at all hours, or immediate service for memorial photographs, because timing was crucial with post-mortem work. They might stress discretion and sensitivity, assuring families that the photographer understood the delicate nature of the work. Some studios maintained relationships with funeral directors, who would recommend specific photographers to families. This created referral networks where funeral directors and photographers supported each other's businesses. The funeral director might even arrange for the photographer to arrive, taking that burden off the grieving family. This coordination ensured that memorial photographs could be taken during the viewing period before burial. Pricing for post-mortem photography was generally higher than for standard portrait work, reflecting the difficult circumstances, odd hours, travel to homes rather than studio work, and the rush nature of the service. Some photographers charged premium rates for middle-of-the-night calls or for particularly difficult situations. However, many photographers also showed flexibility with families in financial distress, sometimes offering reduced rates or payment plans for working-class clients who desperately wanted memorial images but struggled to afford them. Photographers developed specialized equipment for post-mortem work. Portable camera systems that could be easily transported to homes were essential. Lighting equipment that could work in poorly lit rooms was necessary. Some photographers created or purchased special stands and supports designed specifically for holding bodies in various poses during photography. These tools of the trade made the work more efficient and the results more professional. Training for post-mortem photography happened through apprenticeship and practice. There were no formal courses, but experienced photographers would teach newer practitioners the specific techniques required. This included not just photographic skills but also how to interact with grieving families, how to position bodies, how to work quickly and efficiently in emotionally charged situations, and how to create images that balanced honesty about death with dignity and beauty. Competition among photographers for memorial work could be intense in areas where multiple practitioners offered the service. Photographers differentiated themselves through reputation, quality of work, speed of service, and ability to work with families in crisis. Word of mouth was crucial. Families who were satisfied with memorial photographs would recommend that photographer to friends and relatives when death occurred in other households. Some photographers became known for specific specialties within post-mortem work. One might be particularly skilled at photographing infants. Another might be renowned for creating images where the deceased appeared lifelike. Still another might specialize in elaborate group portraits including both living and deceased family members. These specializations allowed photographers to charge premium prices for their particular expertise. The emotional toll on photographers who regularly did memorial work was significant, though rarely discussed in historical records. Repeatedly photographing dead children, working with grieving families, handling corpses, this work affected the photographers who did it. Some eventually stopped offering memorial services, unable to continue with work that was so emotionally draining. Others seemed to develop professional distance, treating it as simply another photographic challenge rather than engaging emotionally with each case. Technical innovations and challenges, minutes 36 to 39. The technical aspects of post-mortem photography presented unique challenges that drove innovation in photographic equipment and techniques. Understanding these technical dimensions helps us appreciate the skill required to create these images. Early daguerreotypes required exposure times of 30 seconds to several minutes, depending on lighting conditions. During this time, the subject had to remain absolutely motionless. For the deceased, this wasn't a problem, they were perfectly still. But for living family members included in post-mortem portraits, maintaining stillness for extended periods was difficult. Even slight movements would create blur in the final image. This is why, in many family post-mortem photographs, the deceased appears sharper and clearer than the living family members around them. Photographers used various devices to help living subjects remain still. Head clamps, which held the subject's head in position, were common in portrait studios. These weren't visible in the final photograph because they were positioned behind the subject, but they helped prevent movement during long exposures. For post-mortem photographs that included living family members, these clamps were essential for achieving sharp images. The deceased had to be positioned carefully and supported to maintain their pose during exposure. For images where the deceased was sitting or standing, hidden supports were crucial. Metal stands with clamps could be positioned behind the subject, attached to the body through clothing, and arranged so they weren't visible in the photograph. These supports had to be strong enough to hold the weight of the body and adjusted precisely to create natural-looking poses. Lighting was perhaps the most significant technical challenge. Post-mortem photographs were typically taken in homes, not in photographers' studios designed with optimal lighting. Natural light from windows was often the primary illumination source, supplemented by mirrors and reflectors to direct and intensify light onto the subject. Photographers had to work with whatever light was available, positioning subjects near windows or setting up complex arrangements of reflective surfaces. The color and texture of dead flesh presented photographic challenges. Dead bodies quickly develop lividity, the pooling of blood that creates purple or dark discoloration in lower areas of the body. They become pale where blood has drained away. The eyes might appear sunken. The mouth might not close properly. Photographers had to minimize these effects through careful positioning, lighting that obscured discoloration, and sometimes post-exposure manipulation of the image. The transition from daguerreotypes to other photographic processes affected post-mortem photography significantly. Wet plate collodion, introduced in the 1850s, required shorter exposure times than daguerreotypes, making the work easier and the results sharper. The process also allowed multiple copies to be made from a single negative, unlike daguerreotypes which were unique images. This meant families could have multiple copies of memorial photographs to share with relatives or keep in different locations. Retouching and manipulation of post-mortem photographs was common and increasingly sophisticated. Photographers would paint over the image to add color to pale cheeks, to hide discoloration, or to open eyes that had been closed. They might smooth skin, add details to hair, or enhance clothing. These manipulations weren't considered deceptive but rather part of the photographer's art, ways of creating the most dignified and beautiful memorial possible. Hand tinting, the practice of adding color to black and white photographs using paints and dyes, was particularly popular for memorial images. Color could make the deceased appear more lifelike, could emphasize certain elements like flowers or clothing, and could create more visually appealing images overall. Skilled hand tinting was expensive, making colored memorial photographs a luxury that not all families could afford. The peak years, 1850s to 1880s. The practice of post-mortem photography reached its peak during the mid to late Victorian era, roughly from the 1850s through the 1880s. During these decades, the practice was most common, most elaborate, and most widely accepted across different social classes and regions. Several factors contributed to this peak. Photography had become more affordable and accessible by mid-century. More photographers were available, competition lowered prices, and technical improvements made the process faster and easier. Families who couldn't have afforded daguerreotypes in the 1840s could afford wet plate photographs in the 1860s and 1870s. Victorian mourning culture was at its height during this period. The elaborate customs around death, the extended mourning periods, the extensive mourning dress codes, all of these were most firmly established and widely practiced during these middle decades of Victoria's reign. Death was highly ritualized, and post-mortem photography fit naturally into the ritual structure. The generation that came of age during this period had grown up with photography. Unlike the oldest Victorians, who had been adults before photography existed and might have viewed it with some suspicion or unfamiliarity, people born in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s had always known photography. It was a natural part of their world, an obvious tool for memory and documentation. Using it to document death seemed as natural as using it to document life. The sheer number of post-mortem photographs taken during these decades was enormous. Almost every family that experienced a death, particularly the death of a child, would have a memorial photograph taken if they could possibly afford it. In cities and towns across America, Britain, and other countries where the practice had spread, photographers were regularly called to photograph the dead. The cumulative result was hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of post-mortem photographs created during this peak period. Notable and famous examples. While most post-mortem photographs documented the deaths of ordinary people whose names are now lost to history, some notable examples have survived that involved famous individuals or became famous themselves for various reasons. One of the earliest and most historically significant post-mortem photographs is of President Abraham Lincoln. After his assassination in 1865, Lincoln's body lay in state, and photographs were taken of him in his coffin. These images documented not just personal loss but national tragedy. However, most of these photographs were confiscated by the government. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton ordered the negatives destroyed, believing that images of the slain president were too sensitive to circulate. Only a few copies survived, and they remain rare and valuable historical documents. Jesse James, the famous outlaw, was photographed after his death in 1882. He was shot by Robert Ford, a member of his own gang, and his body was put on public display. The post-mortem photograph shows James in his coffin, his face visible, the bullet wound apparent. This image was widely distributed and sold as a curiosity, proof that the notorious criminal was really dead. It represents a different use of post-mortem photography, not family memorial but public spectacle and documentation. Wild West figures were frequently photographed after death, particularly if they died violently. Outlaws, lawmen, gunslingers, their deaths were public events, and photographs served as proof, entertainment, and sometimes warning. These images were sold as postcards or cabinet cards, collectibles that people would purchase to own a piece of Western legend. The deaths of Billy the Kid, the Dalton Gang, and various other frontier figures were documented photographically. Some post-mortem photographs became famous not because of who they depicted but because of their exceptional quality or unusual circumstances. Particularly striking images, beautiful children photographed as if sleeping, elaborate family groupings, or technically impressive achievements, might be displayed by photographers as examples of their skill. These exemplar images would be shown to potential clients or entered in photographic exhibitions. The Mutter Museum in Philadelphia houses a collection of post-mortem photographs, including images of conjoined twins Chang and Ing Bunker, who died in 1874. Their post-mortem photograph was taken partly for medical documentation. They were famous in life as Siamese twins, and medical professionals wanted records of their death and the autopsy that followed. This represents another function of post-mortem photography beyond family memorial, medical and scientific documentation. Celebrity deaths in the Victorian era were sometimes commemorated with post-mortem photographs that circulated widely. When a famous actor, politician, or other public figure died, photographs might be taken and reproduced for sale to admirers. These weren't intimate family memorials but commercial products sold to people who felt connected to the public figure and wanted a memento of their passing. Some post-mortem photographs became infamous for their technical achievement. Images where photographers successfully made the deceased appear convincingly alive, elaborate group portraits with difficult lighting, or photographs taken under challenging circumstances. These might be discussed in photographic journals or societies, earning reputations for the photographers who created them. Technical excellence in post-mortem photography was a source of professional pride. The beginning of decline. By the 1890s, post-mortem photography was beginning to decline. The practice didn't disappear suddenly but gradually became less common, less elaborate, and less socially acceptable. Several converging factors contributed to this decline. Photography had become dramatically cheaper and more accessible by the end of the 19th century. George Eastman's introduction of roll film and the Kodak camera in the 1880s revolutionized photography, making it simple enough for amateurs and affordable for working-class families. When photography was expensive and rare, a post-mortem photograph might be the only image a family had of a deceased loved one. But as photography became common, many families already had photographs of their relatives taken during life. The need for post-mortem images as the only available memorial decreased. The snapshot culture that emerged with amateur photography changed attitudes toward photographic portraiture generally. Photographs became casual, spontaneous, ordinary rather than formal and special. The solemn post-mortem photograph fit the earlier era of formal photographic portraiture but seemed increasingly out of step with the more relaxed, candid photography of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods. Funeral practices were changing and becoming more professionalized. Undertakers and funeral homes were taking over functions that had previously been handled by families at home. Bodies were increasingly prepared and displayed in funeral parlors rather than in family parlors. This shift moved death out of the home, creating physical and emotional distance. As funerals became more formal and removed from domestic space, the intimate practice of photographing the deceased at home became less common. Medical advances were slowly reducing mortality rates, particularly child mortality. While children still died in significant numbers, the rates were declining. Improved sanitation, better understanding of disease transmission, early vaccines for some diseases, all of these meant fewer deaths and therefore fewer occasions for post-mortem photography. The practice had been sustained partly by the sheer frequency of death. As death became somewhat less common, demand for memorial photographs decreased. Attitudes toward death were shifting. The elaborate Victorian mourning customs were beginning to seem excessive and morbid to newer generations. Extended mourning periods shortened. Mourning dress became less strict. The culture that had embraced public, ritualized grief was giving way to more private, restrained approaches to mourning. Post-mortem photography, with its intimate documentation of death, began to feel uncomfortable rather than comforting. The emergence of memorial photography alternatives also played a role. Death masks continued to be made. Painted portraits from photographs allowed families to have images of deceased loved ones without requiring post-mortem photography sessions. As photography became common enough that most people had lifetime photographs, these could serve as memorials without need for images taken after death. Social critics began questioning post-mortem photography, particularly the practice of posing the dead to appear alive. What had seemed natural and comforting to earlier Victorians began to appear ghoulish and dishonest to critics who felt that death should be acknowledged directly rather than disguised. The elaborate poses, the painted-on eyes, the props and arrangements, all of this began to be seen as excessive, even disturbing. The practice didn't end uniformly or suddenly. It persisted longer in rural areas than urban centers, longer among certain immigrant communities who maintained old country customs, longer in regions where access to photography remained limited. Even as post-mortem photography declined in mainstream American and British culture, pockets of the practice continued into the early 20th century. Changes in mourning culture. The decline of post-mortem photography was part of broader changes in how Western culture approached death, mourning, and grief. Understanding these larger shifts helps explain why the practice faded. World War I had a profound impact on mourning culture. The scale of death was so enormous, so overwhelming, that traditional mourning practices became impossible to sustain. Entire communities might lose dozens or hundreds of men. How could elaborate mourning be maintained when almost everyone was grieving? The war forced a kind of collective emotional triage, where grief had to be managed more efficiently, more privately, with less external display. After the war, the mood was one of moving forward, not dwelling on death. The Roaring Twenties represented a deliberate turning away from Victorian solemnity toward modernity, jazz, energy, and life. Elaborate mourning seemed old-fashioned, part of the past that the new generation wanted to leave behind. The culture shifted toward celebration of life rather than extended contemplation of death. Photography's increasing ubiquity meant that death was no longer the primary occasion for creating images. In the Victorian era, many people might go months or years between photographs. Each photographic session was a significant event. By the 1920s and 1930s, families might take photographs weekly or even daily. Photos were casual, abundant, ordinary. Death didn't need to be photographed because photographs already existed of the deceased. The medical profession was also changing death. More people died in hospitals rather than at home. Doctors and nurses, rather than family members, were present at the moment of death. Bodies were removed quickly to funeral homes rather than remaining in the house for days. This medicalization and professionalization of death created distance between families and the physical reality of death. The intimate, domestic context that had made post-mortem photography natural was disappearing. Psychological understanding of grief was evolving. While Victorian culture had encouraged extended, public mourning, newer psychological theories suggested that dwelling on death might be unhealthy, that grief should be processed and overcome rather than maintained indefinitely. Freud's work on mourning and melancholia, published in 1917, influenced thinking about healthy versus pathological grief. The new psychological framework suggested that holding on to images of the dead, surrounding oneself with memorials, might prevent proper grief processing. Children's deaths, while still tragic, were becoming less common and were treated differently. As child mortality decreased, each child's death became more individually devastating rather than an expected part of life. Parents grieved intensely but were also encouraged to have more children, to move forward, to not dwell on loss. The elaborate memorialization of dead children that had characterized Victorian practice seemed incompatible with this forward-looking approach. Religious changes also affected mourning practices. Liberal theology was emphasizing life, joy, and social reform rather than death, judgment, and the afterlife. While traditional funeral customs remained, the theological emphasis was shifting. Death was discussed less in church, featured less prominently in religious education. This theological shift contributed to death becoming more private, less publicly processed. The practice continues in some communities. Even as post-mortem photography declined in mainstream Western culture, it persisted in certain communities and contexts. Understanding where and why it continued reveals the practice's cultural flexibility and the diverse meanings it held for different groups. Immigrant communities, particularly those from Southern and Eastern Europe, maintained post-mortem photography longer than established American populations. Italian Americans, Polish Americans, Greek Americans, these communities often preserved old country customs around death for generations after immigration. Post-mortem photography was part of the cultural package they maintained, a connection to traditions from their homelands. Rural communities in America, particularly in Appalachia and the rural South, continued the practice into the mid-20th century. In areas where photography remained less common, where funeral homes were distant or unavailable, where traditional customs persisted with less outside influence, post-mortem photography continued serving the same functions it had in the Victorian era. Families wanted images of their dead, and local photographers continued providing this service. Some religious communities maintained the practice as part of their death rituals. Certain Protestant denominations, particularly more conservative or traditional ones, continued to see value in memorial photography. Some Catholic communities, especially immigrant parishes, maintained the custom. These religious communities had theological frameworks that supported the practice and saw it as consistent with their beliefs about death, memory, and honoring the dead. African American communities in some regions continued post-mortem photography practices, though documentation of this is limited. The practice served similar functions, preserving memory, honoring the dead, creating tangible memorials for families with limited resources. Black photographers who served their communities included memorial photography among their services, understanding its importance even as mainstream culture was abandoning it. In Latin America, post-mortem photography developed its own traditions that persisted longer than in North America. Mexican traditions around Day of the Dead already included elaborate death imagery and celebrations, creating cultural context where photographing the dead didn't seem morbid. Post-mortem photography in Mexico and some other Latin American countries continued well into the 20th century, sometimes taking forms that North Americans found shocking or excessive. The final decades of the practice. By the mid-20th century, post-mortem photography had become extremely rare in mainstream American and British culture. The practice that had once been common and unremarkable had become something that most people found strange, morbid, or incomprehensible. Yet it didn't disappear entirely, continuing in isolated pockets and evolving into new forms. The 1940s and 1950s saw the practice largely confined to rural areas and traditional communities. A family in a remote Appalachian community might still call a local photographer when a child died. An elderly immigrant might request that their body be photographed in keeping with old country customs. But these were exceptions, holdouts against the general cultural trend away from post-mortem photography. Funeral homes occasionally took photographs of the deceased, but these were typically for their own records rather than as family keepsakes. Funeral directors might photograph bodies as documentation of their preparation work, or for use in casket sales catalogs, or simply as part of their administrative procedures. These photographs served commercial and bureaucratic purposes rather than memorial ones. Some families continued to take informal snapshots at funerals, capturing images that included the open casket or the deceased laid out for viewing. These weren't formal post-mortem photographs in the Victorian sense, but rather documentary images of funeral events. A family member with a camera might take pictures at a funeral just as they would at any other family gathering, and the deceased in their casket might appear in some of those images. By the 1960s and 1970s, post-mortem photography in the traditional sense had essentially ended in Western culture. The generational knowledge of the practice was fading. People who remembered when such photographs were common were aging and dying themselves. Younger generations found the very idea disturbing, unable to understand why anyone would want photographs of dead relatives. The photographs that had been created decades earlier were often hidden away by this point. Families who had displayed post-mortem photographs prominently in the Victorian and Edwardian eras now put them in drawers, attics, or storage. Children and grandchildren who inherited these images often didn't know what to do with them, finding them uncomfortable but feeling wrong about destroying family photographs. Some Victorian-era post-mortem photographs were discarded during this period. As older family members died and their possessions were sorted, photographs that newer generations found creepy or disturbing might be thrown away. This happened particularly with photographs of distant relatives, a great-great-aunt whom no one remembered, a great-grandfather who died in infancy. Without living memory connecting to these images, they seemed less like family treasures and more like macabre curiosities. Other photographs survived by chance, tucked into albums or boxes that were preserved without anyone examining their contents closely. These images might not be seen for decades, discovered only when someone finally sorted through inherited materials. The discovery of post-mortem photographs often came as a shock to people who had no idea their family had participated in this practice. Cross-cultural practices and variations. While post-mortem photography declined in Western culture, understanding its practice in other cultures reveals that photographing the dead was never uniquely Victorian or Western. Different societies developed their own approaches to memorial photography, some continuing into the present day. In Mexico and parts of Latin America, photographing the dead remained more culturally acceptable longer than in the United States or Britain. This connected to broader cultural attitudes toward death that were more integrated and less hidden than in Anglo-American culture. Mexican traditions already included elaborate home altars for the dead, Day of the Dead celebrations, and other practices that kept death visible and discussed. Post-mortem photography fit naturally into this cultural context. Mexican post-mortem photographs often had distinctive characteristics. They might show the deceased surrounded by flowers and candles in elaborate home displays. They might include larger family gatherings around the body. They might be taken outdoors or in contexts that North Americans would find unusual. These photographs continued being created well into the late 20th century in some communities, particularly rural areas with strong traditional practices. In parts of Africa, post-mortem photography developed in the colonial and post-colonial periods, influenced by European practices but adapted to local customs and beliefs. Some African communities created photographs that combined Christian funeral practices with traditional beliefs about ancestors and the continuing presence of the dead in community life. These photographs served functions related to both Western memorial traditions and African ancestral veneration. In some Asian cultures, photographing the dead occurred but often in specific contexts. In Japan, for example, photographs might be taken at elaborate Buddhist funeral ceremonies. In parts of South Asia, photographs might document religious death rituals. These practices had different cultural meanings than Victorian post-mortem photography, embedded in different belief systems about death, the soul, and memory. Eastern European Jewish communities had complex relationships with post-mortem photography. Some interpretations of Jewish law discouraged creating images of the dead, viewing it as improper or disrespectful. Other communities, particularly those that had absorbed practices from surrounding cultures, might permit memorial photographs under certain circumstances. The Holocaust complicated this history immensely, as photographs of the dead took on different meanings in the context of genocide and mass murder. Among some Native American communities, attitudes toward photographing the dead varied significantly. Some nations and tribes had strong prohibitions against creating images of deceased people, believing such images could trap or disturb the spirit. Others had no such prohibitions and adopted post-mortem photography when it became available. These practices were diverse, reflecting the diversity of native cultures and their different spiritual beliefs about death and representation. Contemporary anthropologists and ethnographers studying death practices around the world have documented that many cultures continue to photograph the dead in various forms, though often not in ways that resemble Victorian post-mortem photography. The specific practices vary enormously, but the underlying impulse, to document death, preserve memory, mark the transition from life to death, appears across many cultures. Reflection and transition. As we reach the end of this first hour exploring post-mortem photography, let's pause to reflect on what this practice reveals about our ancestors and about ourselves. Take a slow breath, let your body relax further, and consider the strange intimacy of these photographs as you drift toward sleep. The Victorians who photographed their dead were not so different from us. They loved their families, grieved their losses, and sought ways to hold on to memory in the face of death's finality. That they chose to photograph corpses might seem strange to us, but it reflected their particular moment in history, when photography was new and precious, when death was frequent and visible, when mourning was elaborate and public. These photographs capture a threshold moment in human history, a time when ancient practices around death were beginning to intersect with modern technology. For thousands of years, humans had created death masks, preserved bodies, built monuments, and developed countless ways to remember the dead. Photography offered a new tool for this ancient impulse, one that could capture reality with unprecedented accuracy and detail. The practice reveals how profoundly death has changed in Western culture over the past century and a half. Death has moved from the home to institutions, from public ritual to private experience, from frequent everyday occurrence to something that many people can avoid confronting for much of their lives. Post-mortem photography belonged to a time when death was more integrated into daily life, more acknowledged, more discussed. Looking at these photographs today, we're confronted with our own discomfort around death. The images that Victorian families found comforting, we often find disturbing. This discomfort reveals something about how our culture has changed, how we've created distance between ourselves and death, how we've made mortality something to hide rather than honor. Yet there's also something recognizable in these photographs, something that transcends historical distance. The grief visible in parents' faces as they hold their dead children. The care taken to pose bodies with dignity. The flowers, the clothing, the ritual attention to making death as beautiful as possible. These are expressions of love that we can still understand, even if the specific practices feel foreign. As you drift toward sleep, perhaps you'll dream of these long-dead subjects, these children and adults who were photographed so carefully by their grieving families. They were real people who lived, loved, and died. The photographs that remain are their final representations, the last images created before burial made seeing them impossible. Their faces look out at us across more than a century, preserved by chemistry and glass, by silver salts and paper. They are gone, long gone, buried in graves that may no longer be marked or remembered. But the photographs remain, testament to lives lived and losses mourned, to a practice both strange and deeply human. Rest now, knowing that in the second hour, we'll explore how these photographs have been rediscovered, reinterpreted, and understood by modern audiences. We'll examine what happened to these images after the practice ended, how collectors and historians have preserved them, and what contemporary practices echo this Victorian custom. But for now, let yourself settle into sleep. Let the images of post-mortem photography fade into the darkness behind your closed eyes. Let the stories of grief and memory, of love and loss, of attempts to hold on to the departed, let these stories carry you gently into dreams. Sleep well, and when you wake, you can continue the journey through this strange chapter of photographic history. Good night.